the phenomenon of residential school denialism is holding Canadians back from fully participating in the work of reconciliation.
Keep the conversation happening, keep talking about it, and keep it out there about what happened to us as Indian residential school survivors, day school survivors, and the intergenerational impacts that we continue to deal with on a daily basis, even to this day.
We are generations away from healing potentially, but that healing doesn't happen unless we have a better understanding of why we are the way that we are.
Wade Huchwaidip, Phyllis Webstad Rents Quest, Strocham Chatstam Stlakun. What I said was hello to everyone. I'm Phyllis Webstad. I'm from the Kennew Creek Dog Creek First Nation, and I'm here today in Shukwatin Uluch, the land of the Shuswap people. I'm here at our Orange Shirt Society office on the Sugarcane Reserve, which is part of the Williams Lake First Nation. The office is located on Mission Road. We call it the St. Joseph Indian Residential School, which was situated about 5 minutes down the road. We called it the Mission, so that's what they've called the road, Mission Road, named after the mission. 3 generations of my family attended the mission: my grandmother, my mom, my aunts and my uncles, myself and my son, so 14 in total. And I have 1 son and 5 grandchildren, so that's a bit about me.
Wait up. Willie Sellars and Dr. Hello, my name is Chief Willie Sellars with the Williams Lake First Nation. I've been the chief. I'm currently in my 2nd term, my 7th year. Before that, I sat on council for 10 years. I've been in politics a really long time. I've been able to see some really great growth at WLFN and within the Secwepemc Nation, the relationships that we've been able to build with the local municipality and the province and the federal government. I probably most well known for our part in the Sugarcane documentary, which went all the way to the Academy Awards and was nominated for Best Documentary. It follows the investigative works happening at the St. Joseph's Mission. Thankful to be here. Thankful to participate in the conversation with Phyllis and Sean.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Carleton. I'm a Settler historian in the departments of History and Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba here in Treaty 1 territory in the homeland of the Métis Nation. I grew up in British Columbia, though, in North Vancouver, just down the street from the St. Paul's or Squamish Indian Residential School. And I didn't know that until my early 20s. And didn't learn a lot about Indigenous people or my Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh neighbors. It wasn't until my mid-20s when a new family member, Patrick, who was a survivor of the St. Michael's Indian Residential School in Alert Bay, started teaching me more about his experience going through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I really learned about the lasting impacts of residential schooling. That I was called in by him to essentially learn more about residential schooling in British Columbia so that future generations didn't have the excuse of I didn't know about this. So I've spent the last decade or more researching and writing about that history, so that in particular non-Indigenous people can really understand that. And that work has brought me to also understand how some non-Indigenous people respond to that history in very strange ways. And I've since been focused on trying to understand and confront the phenomenon of residential school denialism. And that has shaped much of my work in recent years, trying to understand how denialism is preventing or holding Canadians back from fully participating in the work of reconciliation, and trying to figure out how we can both identify and confront this in positive ways.
And we were a part of this journey of sugarcane for almost 3 years, followed by this festival journey, and of course going all the way to the Academy Awards. But I mean, it is more about raising awareness, like Phyllis said, and keeping the conversation in mainstream media. The most discouraging thing about the history and legacy of residential schools in this country is that not everybody knows about it when they should. And we say that, why must truth come before reconciliation? Canadians and I guess the global population needs to understand the history and the legacy of those schools and the trauma that they had in every single one of our communities. The stories that are depicted in Sugarcane, for example, are only a fraction of the stories that happen in every single community across this country. And when you factor in the Indian boarding school movement in the United States, it is even more apparent of how much damage was done and how there's generations of healing that still needs to happen. I mean, we are trying to heal in our own family units. If Phyllis touched on it, I mean, we are generations away from healing potentially, but that healing doesn't happen unless we have a better understanding of why we are that the way that we are. I mean, how is it that Canadians or residents in the Cariboo-Chilcotin, where we are from, not know that there was a residential school only 6 kilometers from our community core? How is it not being taught in the curriculum? How do people not have a better understanding of why we are triggered the way that we are, the trauma that we're seeing in our substance and uh, alcohol abuse and the mental health issues that we have in our communities? And there are reasons for these things. There are reasons why we don't hold up our culture and our language and our ceremony the way that we do, and historically would have. That was all just taken away from us through these schools and the churches and of course the federal government. So we need to be able to tell that truth. People need to be able to understand before we can get to this healing part of our journey as a country.
The amount of survivors alive at the time that the TRC started was 80,000. In 2023 in Winnipeg, where they announced that number is half of that, 40,000, and declining on a daily basis. So what I'm getting at there is that there will be no survivors left in Canada in the next 50 years. The mission here closed in 1981, so survivors are 44 years old and older. So 50 years, they're going to be like 94. So it's really important that the truth be told at every opportunity. I'm third generation residential school survivor, so my grandmother attended, all of her 10 children, including my mother and myself. I attended for 1 year at the mission, and my son was also at the last operating residential school in Canada when it closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. So 4 generations of my family received payment in 2007 and have gone to residential school. And so the truth, everybody's truth, not only survivors, but their families have a story to tell as well. And if you haven't watched Sugarcane, I think everyone should watch it. If there's going to be curriculum for the schools, that would be great. But yeah, one day there will be no survivors left in Canada.
I'll just note that this year we will be marking the 10th anniversary of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission coming out. And so I think it's appropriate, to for my part to answer the question, why must truth come before reconciliation? To say that because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission explained that was the foundation of building better relations in this country. And I'll just read a little bit from a knock at the door, which is the edited and abridged version of the TRC's final report. And on page 144, the commissioners say this, and I think this speaks to what Phyllis and Willie were saying. They say, too many Canadians know little or nothing about the deep historical roots of these many different issues. Residential schools, yes, but day schools and other experiences as well. They say this lack of historical knowledge has serious consequences for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and for Canada as a whole. In government circles, it makes for poor policy decisions. In the public realm, it reinforces racist attitudes and fuels civic distrust between Indigenous peoples and other Canadians. Too many Canadians still do not know the history of Indigenous peoples' contributions to Canada or understand that by virtue of the historical and modern treaties negotiated by our government, we are all treaty people. That's a little bit more complicated in the BC context. But they say, and this is the important part, history plays an important role in reconciliation. To build for the future, Canadians must look to and learn from the past. So, in short, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, their 6-volume report, thousands of pages, really boils down to a very simple and easy to understand formula. We must have truth about the experiences of residential schools. Truth about that will lead to healing and justice, and healing and justice will give Canada a shot at reconciliation. Now, the problem is that I think in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of progress. There has been a lot of positive developments, people accepting the truth, learning about it, finding ways to build better relationships, to support healing and justice and move towards reconciliation. But just before Murray Sinclair, who is the chairman of the TRC, who was one of my mentors, before he recently passed in the fall, he had said that he felt that Canada was rushing reconciliation and leaving the truth behind, and that increasingly people who don't want to accept the truth figure out, how to show leadership and develop better relations. What they're doing is they're taking the TRC's basic formula and challenging it. They know that if they want to prevent reconciliation and healing and justice, then what they need to do is quibble with the truth, undermine it, twist it, take it out of context, shake public confidence in it so that you can close off the avenue to healing, justice, and reconciliation. And I think, in the 10th year of, as people will be marking the 10th year of the TRC, I think we need to contend with that. There's a lot of positive developments going on, as Chief Sellars was saying. There's a lot of work that's being done, but there is a risk that there are many Canadians who don't want that progress. They want to keep Canada the way that it is because it benefits them. But I think that is throwing an anchor on our progress towards reconciliation, and we need to figure out how we can support survivors to tell their truths before it's too late, as Phyllis noted, so that we can really establish that as our foundation to move on with the important work of healing, justice, and reconciliation. So that's why I think the truth has to come before reconciliation, and why we need to support it right now.
The way that I know how is to keep telling my truth, keep telling my story. And maybe that will have somebody change the way that they think and the way that they behave. Because what I believe is the story is this long. And what people understand is maybe this much. They don't, and they fill in the rest of it with what they think and maybe what they hear and what others have told them, which may or may not be the truth. And I think that's a real problem. I am a visual person, so to me that makes sense. The truth is that there are people alive today that have brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles that never came home. And I've talked to some of these people. I've heard their stories. They're not lying. We're not lying. For me and my family, there's, on my mother's side, I'm Shukwetmuk or Shuswap. I grew up with my grandmother on the reserve. And my father is Scottish. I didn't meet him until 2018, so not very long ago. So I grew up Indigenous, and that my thinking is Indigenous, even though I am 50% Indigenous and 50% non-Indigenous. There's 14 in total of my family. So my grandmother my mother, my aunts, and my uncles, myself, and my son that went to residential school. And I'm thankful that everyone in my family came home. But it could have been a different story. I had many of my family that went to the Indian hospital, the Kokalitsa, and it really hit that one of my aunts, the one that took me from Granny when I was 10 and raised me, uh, I could be saying, I have an aunt that never came home from the Indian hospital or even from the mission to residential school. And I think of how would we deal with that? Because we have to deal with it not only as an individual, but in our families, in our communities, and our nation. So in our family, we are severely impacted by residential school. Us as survivors and intergenerational survivors. So going through that and thinking if we had somebody at these so-called schools that never came home and that are still there, how would we handle that as an individual and a family and as our community? And I know it would be very, very challenging in every way. There would be financial challenges, there'd be physical challenges, there would be emotional, mental challenges. There would be a lot to process. And with the Kamloops 215, with the children, it brought it to the world's attention, even though we knew that this happened. It's almost like the acknowledgement finally happened then, and we were allowed to finally deal with this. And that was only 4 years ago. And what I just mentioned is a lot to deal with individual, family, community, nation. And to have people deny and say the things that they're saying is very hurtful to survivors and their families and our families. There's less than 40,000 survivors left in this country. It's a small percentage of the population. But when these things are said, it is extremely hurtful. And I could only imagine if I had a family member that was still at the mission that didn't come home and people were saying stuff that they're saying, I would be asking, where's your empathy and where's your respect for us as human beings? We're human beings, just like everybody else. And I believe that we as Indigenous people are at an apocalyptic time here on April 23rd, 2025. And I even Googled that, what apocalyptic meant, because I was asked that when I presented if I believe people, if our people were in an apocalyptic time. So that's where I came up with that. And it's apocalypse is a destruction where it's come to a head or an end. So you think of the last 150 years with the settlers coming for the gold, the disease that was brought, our Secwepemc population was decreased by 92%. And along with that, our ways of knowing and being. And then being put onto reserves, the Indian Act, residential school, 60 scope, and now the drug situation and the alcohol situation. So all of that is apocalyptic. And I have a friend that works at the local wellness center for Indigenous families. That's about 20 minutes north of Williams Lake. And I quote her, she says, our families, communities, and nations are getting overrun with the intergenerational trauma and effects to the point where so much pain has become a norm. And we are dealing with our people what was it on the news? 6.7 times the drug overdose rate. And where does that come from? It leads back to residential school and everything else that has happened. So what I say to deniers and to people is you have to own it to know it. And if you don't know it, then you have no right to have an opinion about something that you don't own. Unless you've lived it, I believe that you have no say in what is happening or what your behavior, your attitude about, saying that unless you see a body or that kind of thing, that you're not going to believe it. Like, where is your respect and your empathy? But what we're celebrating is in Williams Lake and BC and other parts of Canada, students are graduating in June of 2026 with K to 12 understanding and participation of the history of residential schools. And I'm calling it a stepping stone on the path to reconciliation. So these students, and I know when I present to them, they give me hugs. They have empathy. Some can only understand that I lost my shirt, and they don't understand anything else when they're little, but they care. And so that's what I'm asking Canadians is care about what happened and, have some empathy for the ones that are alive today that have brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles that never came home. Thank you.
The biggest way that we're going to confront that denialism conversation in this country is to continue to tell our story and continue to be successful in our communities and empower those that haven't had the courage to tell their story, to tell theirs. We still have survivors, we still have elders in our communities that still don't have enough courage to tell their story, to tell their history, to tell their experience. But as we continue to participate in this journey as a country and as a community and as an Indigenous people, as more and more individuals are stepping up, we're starting to get a better understanding of that truth and what our communities have been through historically. But it doesn't just stop, like Phyllis said, with the survivors. I mean, there's that intergenerational trauma that we're still dealing with in our communities. This cycle is not completely broken. I look at my kids, and they'll be the first generation in my family that hasn't dealt with the impacts of residential school, but they're still there in the communities. They don't have a good understanding of the impacts of what I've been through or what my dad's been through or my grandparents have been through. And we're only one small piece of this journey that we're on. I mean, we are a success story, really, in my family. There are so many stories of trauma that hasn't been dealt with. And that's what the denialists don't see. They see one piece of this conversation. And they talk about the good things with the residential school history and legacy, but they haven't, as Phyllis said, they don't have the right to say those things. They haven't lived through what we have in our communities. So we need to continue to thrive, to show them and empower those individuals to tell their story so that they can have a better understanding of that history and legacy, and they can learn from it and change their tune, obviously. I look at the success story that is the Williams Lake First Nation. And, we are an economic development powerhouse in the region. We have agreements with all major industry. We have 3 mines in the traditional territory, which we have impact benefit agreements with. We have a very good relationship with Enbridge and the natural gas pipeline that runs through the territory. We have successful businesses. We have a great relationship with the local municipality and our federal MP, because everybody truly believes in what healing is in this territory, and it's telling the truth, but it is also investing in what that healing should be. And it isn't the federal government that's going to save us. It isn't the local municipality that's going to save us. They are an important part of the conversation, but it is about how are we helping participate in that conversation and empowering those individuals to find their balance and find their healing. It's a tricky balance to find, but it's conversations that are helping us do that. It's relationship building that's helping us do that. And all of this leads back to where the original question is on how we confront denialism is by continuing to be successful and by continuing to tell the truth so that these individuals have a better understanding and they ask that question themselves, because they're only looking at it through one lens at the moment.
Thanks to both of you for those comments, and maybe picking up on something that Chief Sellars was saying there, thinking about, for non-Indigenous people, thinking of reconciliation as a partnership, as a relationship that we, and I'm saying non-Indigenous people, have a direct role to play in. In fact, if you read the TRC report, it's very clear right in its introduction that reconciliation is not an Indigenous burden. It's not an Indigenous responsibility. It's a Canadian responsibility. We need to fix our part of that relationship. Um, and so I think, Kimberly Murray, who is the special interlocutor for the Risen Commission looking into unmarked burials and missing children, in talking about denialism, said, denialism is really a non-Indigenous problem. And as a result, non-Indigenous people need to figure out both what denialism is and how non-Indigenous people can play a role in confronting it. So that's what I'm going to try and take on. I think, absolutely. I think Phyllis and Chief Sellars have laid that foundation. But how can non-Indigenous people understand what this problem is and how we can confront it? So the first thing is to actually understand, apologies for the academic in me, but what denialism actually is. And I'm going to start with what it's not. Um, Residential school denialism is not often that people deny the existence of residential schools, or even that the residential school system, didn't have some harms. Even the most extreme residential school denialists will often start their conversations off by acknowledging, I'm not a denier. But what they are doing is engaging in denialism. And in this case, they are, drawing on the same far right American playbook. How have people defended guns? How have people defended, high pollutant extractivism in other contexts? They engage with something known as denialism, which is usually a rhetorical way, right? Using language to twist, downplay, minimize, okay, the harms of something to create, an alternative understanding. And we have seen the rise of denialism, whether it's climate change denialism or science denialism. We've seen a lot of it in the last decade. Um, as a result of the first Trump presidency and COVID, we have seen a lot of this uh, on the rise. In the context of residential school denialism, okay, we have seen, a number of people, and Chief Sellars mentioned this, right? They will say, "Oh, I'm for reconciliation, but I want to focus on the positives that residential schools had. It was well intentioned. It was of the times. Abuses are being exaggerated. Deaths didn't happen, or they were unavoidable, right? All of these things that sort of, uh, you know, residential schools were bad, but it wasn't genocide, right? These are all the kinds of tricks and talking points that denialists will often use to minimize the harms of residential schools, to shake public confidence. Should we really be focused on reconciliation? They're trying to intervene and use these things to undermine not only public confidence in reconciliation, but a lot of the work that's being done. And that is mostly being done by non-Indigenous people. And a lot of the outlets that are promoting these kinds of talking points are unfortunately associated with the far right. Rebel News, True North, Western Standard, even the National Post gives a platform to people who are continuously producing this material, uh, often for profit, as a form of anti-Indigenous racism, of changing the conversation, of distracting people from the truth, to close off the opportunity of building that better relationship and partnership of reconciliation. Um, so we need to understand that very clearly and see it. I mean, I'm sure if you're on Facebook or any, we live in a country that has closed off comments on our national broadcaster because the anti-Indigenous racism is just out of control. Um, so how do we confront it? Well, I think that Phyllis is right. Even my own experiences confirms this, that I didn't learn this when I was growing up. I could live down the street from a residential school and not know it. Um, there's an education gap in this country. Even 10 years out that we've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the vast majority of people have not read it or understood what's in it. That's a problem. And as a result, people can be allured by these residential school denialist talking points. If they don't know the truth, right, then all of these talking points of, oh, well, it was actually well intentioned, it was of the times, a lot of people died of tuberculosis, what's the big deal? If you don't know the truth and you don't, as Chief Sellars would say, how harmful that is, then you perpetuate it. You promote it at the dinner table, in the hockey dressing room, in your church group, in your community group, right? So what we need to do is raise up that educational gap. And, I'm really inspired by what Phyllis was saying, like that, that people are now learning about this in a different way. It'll take a generation or more, as Murray Sinclair would always say, right? The harm of residential schools happened over generations. The healing and education will take generations too. Um, so I think, part of this is education, right? Murray Sinclair would always say, education is what got us into this mess. Education is what's needed to get us out. But one of the things that's really important is it is about understanding the truth of survivors, reading the TRC, reading memoirs by survivors like Bev Sellars or Ted Fontaine, right? Learning from survivors themselves, hearing what Phyllis has to say in the talks that she gives. But it also means that we need to understand how people will twist those truths out of context to prevent us from building that partnership. So it means that we need to understand what denialism is, how it works, how it operates, who promotes it, who benefits from it, so that we can intervene and challenge it. And there are a variety of tools on the educational front. There's also Leah Gazan, who's proposed adding denialism as a form of hate speech under the criminal code, right? There are a number of different tools that are available, but all of them are predicated on understanding what denialism is and the harms that it creates, and figuring out ways that we can work together to challenge it, to move forward with reconciliation.
So I know when I heard cultural genocide, I thought, why cultural genocide? Why not genocide? And so I'm glad to hear you, Sean, say genocide and not cultural genocide. Because when I was working for a mine, we were doing some consultation in their community, and I was talking to my grandmother, who was about 91 then. And I always wrote down stuff that she said, but she said that ever since they, meaning the settlers, and then the white people came to the country, that they've been trying to kill us. And and with everything that I've learned, it's definitely just plain genocide. So I thank you for that, Sean. And my aunt that raised me, Agnes Jack, she has a book out. She was a part of a book. She's credited on the front cover. It's called Behind Closed Doors, Stories of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. It came out in the late 90s, maybe even early 2000. One of the stories I remember her telling me was survivors were taking her and the researchers that were recording the stories personally to the Orchard area in Kamloops, where they had personally participated in the burial of one of their peers or someone that had died at the school. And so for if those are, and I know some are alive today that have had that experience, and I know I've been given firsthand account of them seeing it on television and how hurtful that is to them to have a firsthand account of knowing where somebody is and what happened and being basically told that they're a liar. And yeah, so Agnes Jack behind closed doors. There's another printing, I believe, happening in June.
Understanding denialism, right, as a tactic, as a strategy, right? It's not an accident. They know what they're doing. Um, the goal is actually to engage in um, these battles over language and use them as a wedge to kind of create more opportunity. So one of the things that you will see, um, for example, in the current context, the candidate in North Island, Powell River, Aaron Gunn, right, was debating on Twitter at the time, now X, whether residential schools constituted genocide. And he was arguing that it did not. And if you actually read what he was saying, he doesn't understand the United Nations definition of genocide, right? He just feels uncomfortable by that, and he's trying to quibble with it. Um, so what he'll say is, residential schools, they're not genocide. I think his quote is, read a book, right? It's not genocide. It's not the Holocaust. And actually, one of the things that denialists often do is they try and narrow the definition of genocide to a very specific incidence of, like, it has to be mass death equivalent to the Holocaust, or it doesn't count, which is actually not what the United Nations definition of genocide is. It includes, yes, death, but also the removal of children from community, the attack on group life through culture. All of these things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission very clearly in its introduction explain how residential schools fit genocide. The House of Commons unanimously, right, in 22, with Pierre Poilievre in attendance, agreed that it is genocide. But what denialists will do is they'll constantly just twist. It's like, genocide has to mean that everyone involved was like a blood thirsty monster. And if it doesn't meet that threshold, then it's not genocide. And if it's not genocide, well, then maybe it wasn't so bad. And we should be talking about the positives. And if it wasn't so bad, then maybe we shouldn't really be talking about reconciliation. Maybe we don't need a change, right? This is what they're constantly doing over and over and over again. The quibbling of these using language to try and shift the conversation. And we need to be smart enough to know what they're doing. They're using the same talking points over and over again. The other example in British Columbia is Dallas Brody, right, who is an elected member of the Legislative Assembly, right, who is working on this very small thing, right, saying there's no death. There has been no death found, which is wrong. We already know that more than 4,000 children died in residential schools, right? We know, thanks to the team at Williams Lake working to get access to additional records, that more children died in that school than what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was able to find. We know that. But what she's trying to do is engage in this disingenuous, like, show me there's been no death found at Kamloops. Well, the investigation isn't over, right? But her audience doesn't care about those nuances, right? They're just trying to disingenuously engage with this twisting of language that shakes public confidence, that creates space for anti-Indigenous racism. And a broken clock, she'll say that's just the fact. Well, a broken clock is right twice a day. That's also a fact. But we don't set our clocks to them to change to tell the time. And that's why understanding what denialism is, how they engage disingenuously with language like this, is important, because we can see what they're doing. and we can brush them to the side, right? Rather than get caught in the trap of debating these people, right? We can say, that we've already that's already been decided. This is genocide. We know that. Uh, Kamloops, the investigation isn't over at Kamloops, so let them finish their investigation, and then we can talk about that. If you want deaths, we already have evidence of that publicly available. So I think understanding how denialists grab onto language, sometimes errors that people make to try and create a wedge for them to introduce and spread more denialism, it's really an important part of the confronting it, to make sure that we don't give denialists more of a platform.
We definitely don't condone anyone who is trying to skew facts and conversation around the truth and the true history of our communities and the impacts that the residential school system had in we are still experiencing. Uh, I mean, the language piece is a tough one because it does add fuel to the minority of the politicians in this country who are trying to hold it up as if it is the truth and are trying to skew the truth to, I guess, deter what is the true history of what those schools mean and what they did and the legacy of them. I have that firsthand experience of the investigative works at the St. Joseph's Mission because of the works that we're continuing to do around the missing, murdered, lost children. And you could say with confidence that if we were to start excavating the anomalies in where we've been able to identify areas of interest and using ground penetrating radar pinpoint areas of interest, uh, do we want to do that? Do we want to start excavating graves? And that's a massive trigger in a conversation that I can't answer by myself. That's a conversation that the survivors and that our communities need to answer and be supportive of. It makes more sense to us in the path that we're currently continuing to go down is to create a place of healing, not just for the survivors in our communities and the nations that had kids represented at the St. Joseph's Mission, but for Canadians. We want to be able to educate them so that the denialists and the ones that are holding up the untruth can come to the site and experience and have a real life experience of the impact that the schools had on the Indigenous peoples of this country. And creating a place of healing, creating a place of education is how we're going to continue to change the perspective of these individuals so that they will be cognizant when they are using the language that they are using in the political conversations that they're having, whether it's at the municipal level, whether it's at the regional level, whether it's at the provincial level, or whether it's at the federal level. And we have to be cognizant of all of these conversations happening at the same time and try and find this balance of healing in our communities. The politics around the history and legacy of residential school are incredibly tough and challenging because we have to be cognizant and we have to understand, how hurtful and how big of a trigger it is to, I guess, diminish or look at how we belittle the experience that our people had at those schools and the trauma that we're still experiencing, whether it's direct or whether it's intergenerational. Because we all, I'd like to hope, want to get to, a healthy country. But the language piece of those conversations is a big one that we have to realize the impacts that they have if we word it improperly. So it's a tough one for sure.
I mean, I think, one of the things that Chief Sellers was saying, at the end of your previous response was like, that we want to have a healthy relationship. We want to have healthy communities. We want to build a better future for our kids, right? Like I have a new daughter who's almost a year old, and the last year I've been thinking a lot about the future and the kinds of things that we leave for our kids. We leave for, future generations, right? Thinking about 7 generations before us, 7 generations ahead. And I mean, I think what's so frustrating about the current moment in many ways, right, is that people are buying into, I think, a lot of division and hatred against other people as a way of sort of protecting themselves or holding on to whatever limited forms of privilege or profit that they've got. Um, and there isn't really a lot of focus on trying to like build better relationships. We think about in the context of residential school denialism, like a lot of these folks are like are tethered to like a toxic understanding of the past, right? If we think about Polyev, just as an example, earlier this year before the election, right, he came out, he's talking on like far right podcasts with Jordan Peterson and whatever, saying, like we need to develop an unapologetic approach to the past. What are you talking about? Why? Well, like we need to restore the honor of John A. Macdonald. No, we don't. No, we don't. That's not what history is. History is about learning from the past to create a better future. And, I think in a lot of work that I do working with students, I see that, right? They don't want to like just defend the past, right? They want to understand it to build something better in the present to create a more honorable future. And I think that that's why doing this work of understanding what denialism is, confronting it is part of a more hopeful vision of what the future could be, creating pathways for Indigenous people to do the work they need to do, for non-Indigenous people to be doing the work of reconciliation, right? We've only got 14 of 94 calls to action done in 10 years. That's not good enough. We need to continue to move forward. And in order to move forward, non-Indigenous people need to learn from the past rather than defend it or try to keep it going, right? We need to make a shift. And I think a lot of the extremism that we are seeing emerging, not just in the United States, but here in Canada and around the world, is trying to keep us stuck in the cul-de-sac of colonialism rather than break it and find something more positive to build those better relationships. And I hope that in part, conversations like this can help inspire people to do just that in a nonpartisan way, right? Um, to figure out ways to build those better relationships, communities up, right? And work together. And if our political parties are not offering, ways forward in that, then we need to push them, and we need to find ways to continue to do that work. Um, so that's sort of my response is that if we go back to that core teaching of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, truth will lead to healing and justice. Healing and justice will give us that shot at reconciliation. We need to work together to make sure that we can do that. And these kind of extremist ideas, the dividing and conquering, it keeps us stuck. And I don't think that we need to do that. I think we need to have these conversations to figure out how we can move forward together.
I mean, the political landscape in our country nowadays, that we seem like, I mean, the headlines are what people are after, is what it seems like to me. I mean, I have faith, and I believe, and I'm hopeful that whichever government is in power is a government that's going to work with Indigenous peoples and work with the Williams Lake First Nation. I mean, we are a conservative country here, and our MP is great. We've seen the benefits of working with a liberal government, and Trudeau is also a good friend. But I mean, regardless of who's in power, it always seems to be controversy across the board. I mean, as long as the concerns and the initiatives and the work that we're doing at WLFN is moving along, we are going to continue to be happy, and we'll work proactively with whichever government is in provincial or federally. And it's that faith that we have to have as Canadians, and the belief in the system that is going to move us along. We cannot get ourselves into a situation where the progress and the work done to date stops happening. And that is the biggest fear in probably every Indigenous community, and with every Canadian in this country. I'd like to hope that whoever is in power is going to work with us and opinions aside or stances aside, they're going to hold up what the true meaning of reconciliation is, and helping us find that balance and heal from the horrific legacy and history of residential schools and the impacts that it's had in our communities as Indigenous peoples.
I have a book coming out in August called Decolonization in Me, and talks about some of the Indigenous sovereignty, and people don't understand that word and what it means and why we are treated differently by Canada, like with the government, and why. So in my and with Christy that I've done the book with, have attempted to answer some of the questions and address some of the comments that we've seen in media and on Facebook, and it's different than what I've done, but it's a part of me speaking up. I don't always like controversy, but I just want to keep the conversation happening, keep talking about it, and keep it out there uh, about what happened to us as Indian residential school survivors, day school survivors, and the intergenerational impacts that we continue to deal with on a daily basis, even to this day. So I thank you, Emily, for hosting us, and Greenpeace for having us on this recording, and I thank Sean and Chief Sellars as well for agreeing to be here today. We're all busy doing what we do, so I just say Cook's Jam to everyone.